Rome had a system for what happened to a conquered queen. Chains, a procession, a crowd trained to cheer at the sight of her fall. It had worked on every ruler who ever stood against the empire. It did not work on this one. In the year 60 AD, in the damp, forested edge of the known world, a province the Romans called Britannia, a queen was flogged in front of her own people. Her daughters were assaulted. Her husband's kingdom, promised to Rome under a treaty, was seized anyway, its nobles stripped of their land, its elders enslaved for debts they never agreed to. Rome expected silence. Rome had built an empire on the assumption that humiliation produces obedience. Instead, it produced fire. Within weeks, 3 of Roman Britain's wealthiest cities were ash. A legion sent to crush the revolt was annihilated in the open field. For a moment, a real, historically documented moment, the Emperor Nero considered abandoning the entire province and pulling Rome out of Britain for good. And the woman at the center of it never stood in a Roman triumph. She was never marched in chains down the sacred way. Rome never got to display her. This is the story of Boudica, queen of the Iceni, not a story of a queen who was captured, like so many others, but of the one queen who made sure Rome never had the chance to try. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a grieving widow became the most feared enemy Rome faced in the entire 1st century, and why, 2,000 years later, her statue stands within sight of the British Parliament, staring east toward Rome. Not every kingdom that fell to Rome fell in battle. Some fell on paper. The Iceni, a tribe controlling what is now Norfolk in eastern Britain, were never conquered outright in the initial Roman invasion of 43 AD. Instead, their king, Prasutagus, did what a number of British rulers did when the legions arrived. He negotiated. He became what Rome called a client king, allowed to keep his throne, his laws, his people, so long as he acknowledged Rome as his ultimate master and kept the peace. For nearly 2 decades, this arrangement held. Prasutagus ruled, Rome collected its influence quietly, embedding loans, tribute, and political leverage into every layer of Icenian life. It was not freedom, but it was survival, and for a kingdom on the edge of an empire that had already swallowed half of Britain, survival was not a small thing. Prasutagus tried to make that survival permanent. In his will, he named the Roman Emperor Nero as a co-heir alongside his own 2 daughters, a calculated diplomatic gesture. Half the kingdom to Rome, half to his family, a gift offered in advance, meant to protect what remained of his line. He believed a will written for Rome would be respected by Rome. He was wrong. When Prasutagus died in 60 AD, Rome did not read his will as an act of diplomacy. It read it as an opening. Roman officials moved immediately, not to honor the agreement, but to erase it. The kingdom was not divided as promised. It was annexed outright, absorbed as though Prasutagus had never ruled it at all. Roman soldiers and administrators swept through Icenian territory. Land was confiscated. Nobles who had spent a generation as Rome's allies were treated overnight as conquered subjects. And underneath the seizure sat an older grievance, one that had been quietly poisoning the relationship for years. Loans. The philosopher and statesman Seneca, tutor to Nero, one of the wealthiest men in the empire, had reportedly pushed enormous loans onto British nobles. Loans they had not entirely wanted, at terms designed to bind them to Rome. Now, with Prasutagus dead and the kingdom in chaos, those loans were called in all at once. Families that had built their status on Roman favor found that favor withdrawn in an instant, replaced by debt collectors backed by soldiers. This was not merely cruelty, it was policy. Rome had learned that a client kingdom's death was the most efficient moment to finish absorbing it, while the population was distracted by grief, before a new order could organize resistance. What Rome had not accounted for was who would lead that resistance. Tacitus, writing decades later with access to Roman military records, describes what happened next in language that is startling for how bluntly it is stated. Boudica, the widowed queen, now acting as the highest surviving authority of her people, was publicly flogged. Her 2 daughters were raped. This was not disorganized violence. In Roman administrative logic, it was a demonstration, proof that the old royal family held no special status anymore, that the treaty was void, that the Iceni were now simply a conquered people like any other. The flogging of a queen in front of her own subjects was a message aimed at everyone watching, not just at her. Rome had used this tactic before, elsewhere in the empire, and it had worked. Humiliation as a substitute for a battle Rome didn't want to fight. Break the symbol publicly enough, and the population breaks with it. What Rome misjudged was the specific chemistry of grief, humiliation, and authority sitting inside one furious woman who was, by every Roman account that survives, formidable even before this moment. Cassius Dio, writing generations later, left behind a physical description of her that reads less like a passing detail and more like an attempt to explain to a Roman audience how something like this could have happened at all. Tall, fierce-eyed, a harsh, commanding voice, a mass of red gold hair falling past her hips. Rome had just handed a weapon to the one person capable of using it. It matters that Boudica was a woman, because it mattered enormously to Rome. Roman writers did not process her the way they processed a defeated king. A king who lost was a rival removed. A woman who nearly destroyed a Roman province was something closer to an insult to the entire structure of how Rome understood power. An embarrassment that later historians would spend real energy trying to explain away or moralize into a lesson. That discomfort is visible in how carefully Tacitus frames her. He gives her a battlefield speech before the final confrontation, almost certainly invented, in the tradition of ancient historiography. But the content of that invented speech is revealing. In it, Boudica reportedly told her assembled warriors that she fought not as a queen avenging her lost kingdom, but as an ordinary woman avenging her flogged body and her violated daughters. Personal, not political. Rome needed her rage to be personal, because a purely political rebellion, a calculated uprising against imperial policy, was a far more dangerous idea to let spread. But the personal and the political were never separate for Boudica. Her body had been used to punish her kingdom. Her kingdom would now be the weapon she used to answer. She did not raise an army of Iceni alone. She raised an alliance. Grievance, it turned out, was not unique to the Iceni. To the south, the Trinovantes, once a proud independent tribe, had their own decades of resentment. Camulodunum, their former capital, had been seized by Rome and turned into a colonia, a settlement for retired Roman soldiers, veterans granted land that had until recently belonged to Trinovantian families. Those families had been pushed out, their homes and fields handed to strangers wearing the uniform of the empire that took them. Worse, at the center of Camulodunum stood a temple, built in honor of deified Emperor Claudius, funded through forced local contributions that the Trinovantes experienced not as religious devotion, but as a permanent, humiliating tax, a monument to their own conquest that they were made to pay for themselves. When word spread that the Iceni queen had been flogged and her daughters violated, and that she was gathering warriors, the Trinovantes did not need much persuading. Two tribes with two separate grievances found they were fighting the same enemy for the same underlying reason. Rome had promised a version of coexistence and delivered confiscation instead. Ancient sources suggest the combined force may have reached into the tens of thousands. Modern historians treat the largest ancient estimates with caution, but even conservative readings describe an army large enough to erase a Roman colonia in a matter of days. Camulodunum did not know what was coming until it was already too late to stop it. Camulodunum was not built for war. It had no defensive wall, an almost unbelievable oversight for a Roman settlement, but one that reveals exactly how safe Rome believed Britain had become. Roman power there rested on reputation, not fortification. Reputation does not stop an army. When Boudica's forces arrived, the town's veteran population, aging former soldiers, unprepared for a coordinated assault, had little real defense to offer. Roman administrators sent an urgent request for reinforcements. Only a small force arrived, nowhere near enough. The city fell with brutal speed. Survivors retreated into the Temple of Claudius, the same monument that had symbolized their domination over the Trinovantes for years, and held out for 2 days behind its heavy stone walls before it too was overrun. Archaeologists digging in modern Colchester, built on top of Roman Camulodunum, have found something that reads like a geological record of the attack. A distinct, unmistakable layer of scorched red destruction debris, dated precisely to this period, running beneath the modern city. Burned grain, melted glass, collapsed masonry, fused by heat intense enough to leave a permanent scar in the archaeological record nearly 2,000 years later. The Roman 9th Legion, Legio the 9th Hispana, under the command of Quintus Petilius Ceralis, marched to relieve the city. They arrived too late to save it, and rode straight into a force that outnumbered and outmaneuvered them completely. The infantry accompanying the legion was annihilated. Ceralis escaped with only his cavalry, fleeing back to his fortress in humiliation. Rome's first response to the uprising had just been erased from the field entirely. To understand why Rome was caught so completely unprepared, you have to look at where its Britannia commander actually was when the revolt began. Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor of Britain, was on the opposite side of the province, deep in campaign against the Druidic stronghold on the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, off the coast of Wales. Rome viewed the Druids not merely as a religious tradition but as an active center of resistance, a network capable of uniting British tribes against imperial rule. Suetonius had taken his best legions there specifically to break that network for good. It was, from a purely military standpoint, entirely reasonable strategy. It was also, in hindsight, a catastrophic blind spot. While Rome's most capable general and his best troops were pinned down on the far western edge of the province, the eastern heartland, wealthy, lightly defended, administratively arrogant, was left almost undefended. News of the uprising reached Suetonius only after Camulodunum had already fallen. He turned his forces east immediately, moving with a speed that ancient sources treat as remarkable, riding ahead of his main infantry with cavalry to reach the province's other major settlements before Boudica's army could. He would not be fast enough to save all of them, but he would be fast enough to make one of the most consequential decisions of the entire revolt. Londinium in 60 AD was not yet the capital of Roman Britain. That status still belonged to Camulodunum, at least on paper, but it was already something more valuable in practical terms. A booming commercial hub, a river port on the Thames, filled with merchants, traders, and the administrative infrastructure of Roman commerce. Suetonius reached it first, ahead of Boudica's army, riding hard with a small cavalry escort. And there, he made a decision that has been debated by historians for 2,000 years. He looked at the town. He looked at the size of the force bearing down on it. And he calculated that he did not have nearly enough soldiers to defend it. So he left. Tacitus records this with something close to discomfort in the writing. A Roman governor abandoning a Roman town to its fate, choosing the survival of his army and the eventual survival of the province over the immediate defense of a single city. It was, by any modern military logic, almost certainly the correct call. Defending Londinium with an insufficient force would have meant losing both the town and the army that Rome desperately needed intact. But correct strategy and moral comfort are different things. Suetonius rode out, taking with him anyone willing and able to travel quickly. Everyone who stayed behind, the elderly, the injured, those who couldn't or wouldn't leave their homes and businesses, was left to face Boudica's army alone. What happened next is, according to Roman sources, one of the darkest chapters of the entire revolt. Boudica's forces reached Londinium and found a town with almost no military defense left. Tacitus describes what followed in blunt terms. Those who remained were tortured and killed. The settlement burned to the ground without meaningful resistance. This was not incidental destruction from a battle. It was, by every surviving account, a deliberate act of annihilation. A message aimed at Rome, as clearly as the flogging had once been aimed at the Iceni. If Rome could humiliate a queen in public to prove a point, Boudica's forces could destroy a Roman town in public to prove the opposite one. Modern archaeology confirms the ancient accounts with unsettling precision. Beneath the streets of modern London, excavators have repeatedly uncovered the same telltale marker found at Camulodunum, a thick red and black layer of burned debris, roughly 2,000 years old, sitting directly beneath the earliest Roman occupation layers of the city. Archaeologists sometimes refer to it, informally, as the Boudican destruction horizon, a scar embedded in the ground itself, a geological signature of a single catastrophic event, still detectable in construction sites across the modern financial district nearly 2 millennia later. London, the city that would one day become one of the largest in the world, was, for a brief period in the year 60 AD, simply gone. One city might have been dismissed by Rome as a tragic loss. Two was a crisis. A third confirmed that Rome was facing something it had not faced anywhere else in the empire. A coordinated, sustained, and devastatingly effective campaign of annihilation. Verulamium, near modern St. Albans, was a settlement populated largely by Romanized Britons, locals who had adopted Roman customs, Roman dress, Roman citizenship where they could get it. In some ways, that made it an even more pointed target than the first two cities. This was not simply Rome being punished. It was a message to any Briton who had chosen to align themselves with the empire rather than resist it. The destruction followed the same pattern as before. The town was overrun, its population killed or scattered, its buildings burned. Archaeological excavation has, once again, found the matching layer of scorched debris beneath the modern town, the third confirmed instance of the same destruction horizon, spread across 3 cities and dozens of miles, all within the span of a few catastrophic weeks. Tacitus estimated the combined death toll across all 3 cities at roughly 70,000 people. Even accounting for likely ancient exaggeration, the scale being described was, for Roman Britain, unprecedented. There is something uniquely unsettling about the Boudican destruction horizon as physical evidence, separate from anything written by Tacitus or Cassius Dio. Ancient historians can exaggerate. They can invent speeches, round up casualty numbers, shape a narrative to fit the moral lesson they want their Roman readers to absorb. A layer of burned debris fused into the earth cannot do any of that. It simply sits there, unchanged for 2,000 years, until someone digs down far enough to find it. Modern construction projects in London still occasionally hit this layer. A reddish, ash-heavy band of soil, sometimes containing melted glass, carbonized grain, and the collapsed remains of Roman period buildings, dated with remarkable consistency to the exact window of 60 to 61 AD. It is, in a very literal sense, the fingerprint of Boudica's revolt, the one piece of this story that required no historian, no invented speech, no Roman political framing to survive into the present day. While Rome controlled how the written record would remember her, it never controlled what the ground itself preserved. 3 burned cities were now behind Boudica's army. One Roman general was now directly ahead of it. Suetonius Paulinus understood something that would decide the entire outcome of the war. He could not win by matching Boudica's numbers. He had to win by choosing exactly where and how the two forces would meet. Having abandoned Londinium and gathered what forces he could, reportedly somewhere close to 10,000 men, a fraction of the size of the British coalition bearing down on him, Suetonius retreated along a Roman road until he found terrain that erased his numerical disadvantage. Ancient sources describe the site only in general terms, a narrow valley or defile, likely somewhere along the road historians now call Watling Street, with dense woodland protecting his rear and flanks. The exact location remains debated by historians and archaeologists to this day. No site has ever been definitively confirmed. But the tactical logic of what he chose is clear enough from the descriptions that survive. A narrow approach meant Boudica's much larger force could not spread out to encircle him. It meant only a limited number of her warriors could engage his line at any given moment, no matter how many thousands stood behind them. The forest at his back meant no surprise attack from the rear. Suetonius Paulinus was about to turn a battle he could not win through numbers into a battle decided entirely by position, discipline, and the brutal efficiency of Roman infantry doctrine. Before the battle, both commanders reportedly addressed their forces, and both speeches, as recorded by Tacitus and Cassius Dio, were almost certainly composed by the historians themselves, a common and openly practiced convention in ancient historiography. But invented or not, they are worth examining, because of what each was designed to represent to a Roman reading audience. Boudica's speech, as Tacitus renders it, invokes personal grief and righteous vengeance, a wronged woman leading wronged people, fighting for dignity rather than territory. It is emotional, immediate, and framed as a final, all-or-nothing stand. Suetonius's speech, by contrast, is composed almost entirely of Roman military doctrine. Trust your discipline, hold your formation, let the enemy's numbers work against them in confined terrain. Do not break ranks chasing a rout. It is cold, procedural, and entirely about control. Historians have long noted that the contrast is almost certainly intentional on Tacitus's part, not merely reporting two speeches, but staging a philosophical argument between two entirely different theories of power: passion versus discipline, vengeance versus procedure, a queen speaking as an individual, and a general speaking as an instrument of an institutional system built to outlast any individual within it. Only one of those theories was about to be proven correct on this particular battle. One detail recorded by the ancient sources has struck historians for centuries as almost tragically ironic: the wagons. Britons who fought alongside Boudica were said to have brought their families to watch the battle from behind their own lines. Wives, children, entire communities arranged in wagons positioned to observe what everyone expected would be a final, decisive victory over Rome. It was meant as an act of confidence, confirmation that this would be the battle that ended the war. Instead, that wall of wagons became something else entirely once the battle turned against them, a physical barrier blocking their own retreat. When the narrow terrain that Suetonius had chosen began working exactly as intended, funneling the British advance into a tight, congested mass, unable to bring its numerical advantage to bear, the momentum of the battle shifted violently. And when British warriors began falling back under the pressure of Roman discipline, they found the ground behind them already filled with their own wagons, their own families, their own line of retreat cut off by the very people they had brought to witness their triumph. What was meant to be a monument to coming victory became, within hours, a killing field with no way out. The battle itself, as Tacitus describes it, did not unfold as a chaotic clash of two roughly equal forces. It unfolded as a demonstration of exactly what Roman military discipline was built to do against exactly this kind of opponent. Suetonius's legionaries held their formation in the narrow approach, absorbing the initial British charge without breaking. Then, at a calculated moment, they advanced in a tight wedge formation, using the confined terrain to their full advantage. A compact, disciplined mass of shields and short swords pushing into a British force that had no room left to maneuver, no room to bring its full numbers to bear, and, increasingly, no room to retreat. Roman cavalry closed in on the flanks. The wagon line at the British rear turned the retreat into a slaughter rather than an escape. Tacitus's numbers, like most ancient casualty figures, should be read with some skepticism, but even by conservative modern estimates, the battle was a catastrophic, one-sided defeat for the British coalition. Tacitus claims roughly 80,000 Britons were killed, against fewer than 400 Roman losses. Whatever the true figures, every ancient and modern account agrees on the essential shape of the outcome. The alliance that had burned 3 Roman cities to the ground was annihilated in a single afternoon of disciplined, methodical violence. The revolt that had, for a few extraordinary weeks, threatened to end Roman Britain entirely, was over. Boudica was not among the captured. This is the detail that separates Boudica's story from almost every other captured or defeated ruler in Rome's long historical record. She did not surrender. She was not taken alive. She was not marched through the streets of a Roman city in chains, displayed as evidence that resistance had failed, the way so many defeated rulers before and after her would be, the way Zenobia of Palmyra would be, 2 centuries later, paraded through Rome as a living trophy. The 2 Roman sources that survive disagree on exactly how it happened. Tacitus states plainly that Boudica ended her own life by poison, a final act of control in a story that Rome had tried, from the very beginning, to strip her of all control. Cassius Dio, writing later, records instead that she fell ill and died, though even his account notes that the illness followed the collapse of her army with a timing that many historians since have found difficult to read as coincidence. Whichever version is closer to the truth, the outcome carried the same essential meaning. Rome had built an entire system around the psychological theater of a captured ruler. The procession, the chains, the crowd trained to cheer at the sight of a fallen queen paraded through the streets. That system depended entirely on having the person to display. Boudica denied Rome that, whatever she was in her final moments, defeated, dying, exhausted from a war she had already lost, she was never Rome's property to display. She made sure of that herself. Victory did not mean mercy. In the aftermath of Watling Street, Suetonius Paulinus pursued a scorched earth policy across Iceni and allied territory, reprisals severe enough that they eventually alarmed Rome's own administration back in the capital. A newly arrived Roman financial official, Julius Classicianus, reported back to Nero that Suetonius's continued harsh reprisals were making the situation in the province worse, not better, provoking further resistance rather than pacifying it. The report was serious enough that Nero eventually replaced Suetonius Paulinus with a new governor, Petronius Turpilianus, whose approach was deliberately less punitive, focused on stabilizing the province through reduced hostility rather than continued retribution. It is a small but telling detail. Even by Rome's own standards, the reprisals following Boudica's defeat were considered excessive. An empire that had built its authority on calculated, controlled displays of power recognized that uncontrolled brutality in the aftermath was creating exactly the kind of unrest it was meant to prevent. For a brief period, the revolt had been serious enough that ancient sources suggest Nero genuinely considered withdrawing Roman forces from Britain entirely, abandoning the province less than 2 decades after conquering it. That withdrawal never happened. Britain would remain part of the Roman Empire for nearly 4 more centuries. But for a few weeks in the year 60 AD, that outcome was not guaranteed at all. For centuries after her death, Boudica occupied a strange, marginal place in European memory, present in surviving Roman texts but rarely centered, rarely celebrated, filtered almost entirely through the perspective of the empire she fought against. That began to change nearly 1,500 years later, during the reign of another queen. In Elizabethan and later Victorian England, Boudica's story was rediscovered and reshaped into something new, a patriotic symbol, a native British queen who had stood against a foreign empire and nearly won. The Latinized name Boudica, used throughout the Victorian era, became attached to poems, paintings, and eventually, a monument. In 1902, a bronze statue titled Boudica and Her Daughters, designed decades earlier by the sculptor Thomas Thornycroft, was installed beside Westminster Bridge in London, close enough to the Houses of Parliament that it stands today within view of the seat of British government. The Queen is shown standing in a war chariot, daughters beside her, spear raised, facing outward toward the city that was, 2,000 years earlier, one of the places her army burned to the ground. Rome spent centuries controlling how conquered rulers would be remembered, using triumphs and public spectacle to fix their images as symbols of defeat. Boudica's image escaped that control entirely, reshaped, centuries later, into something Rome never intended and never could have controlled. A monument to the war she almost every captured queen in Rome's long history followed roughly the same arc. Defeat, capture, display. A crown turned into evidence, a body turned into a warning, an entire identity absorbed into Rome's public memory of its own triumph. Boudica's story ends differently, and that difference is the entire point of telling it. She lost the war. Her army was annihilated. 3 cities she burned were eventually rebuilt, larger and more thoroughly Roman than before. In the most literal, immediate sense, Rome won completely. The revolt was crushed, the province remained, the empire continued largely unchanged. But Rome never got the one thing its entire system of conquest was built around: the queen herself, alive, chained, and paraded, as proof that resistance always ends in submission. Whatever choice she made in her final hours, poison, illness, or something in between that no surviving record fully explains, it was a choice, made on her own terms, in a story where almost nothing else had been left to her control. That is why her statue faces the way it does. Not chained, not kneeling, not displayed as evidence of Rome's absolute reach, the way Zenobia's procession once was. The way so many other rulers' final moments were staged for a cheering Roman crowd. Standing, armed, facing forward. Rome perfected the art of turning captured queens into permanent warnings. Boudica made sure she would never be one.